Well, hello, and this is the second of our two videos on the executive branch and the federal bureaucracy. In this one, we'll take up the last three topics of the first slide in the first show. How the agencies are held accountable. We'll talk about the rulemaking process with an example of how they make the rules. I explained it in how the process works in the last video, but now I want to really go into the details, give you an example. And then a bit about budgeting. First, part of the accountability of government workers in the bureaucracy has to do with politics. They're not supposed to get involved in politics in certain ways, and I'm going to explain that to you. And the key piece of legislation is something called the Hatch Act, or the Political Activities Act of 1939. It limits what federal employees can do in the realm of politics, and it's been amended, and the original rules were stricter than the rules that we have today, so there's been a bit of relaxation. So I'm going to go over them briefly for you, what federal employees can and can't do. What they can do, they can run for office. They can engage in voter registration drives. They can try to help other people get registered. They can express their opinions like anyone else. They can attend political rallies, meetings, and fundraisers. They can sign petitions just like you and I. They can join organizations, and they can even campaign for candidates. But here's what they can't do. They cannot use their office in any way to influence voters. So this involves a number of things. For example, they can't solicit campaign contributions from the public. Because, it might appear that if you want the government service from the employee, you have to contribute to the candidate they're favoring. And they also can't engage in any political campaign activity while on duty. That is, while they are in the office, while they are in uniform, or while they are using government property or a government website. I mean, they can certainly, campaign for candidates, but they can't do it while they're on duty during their working day. And they also can't run for office in a partisan election. So I said they can run for office. They can run for certain offices, but not the partisan offices. They can run for nonpartisan offices. Now, we're going to talk now about, in terms of accountability, about how other agencies of the government supervise them. So there's executive branch oversight, congressional oversight, and court oversight. The executive branch control includes the president, but not just the president. So there's the appointment power. That is, the presidents have the appointment power. And then we have rules, bureaucratic rules within agencies about who can get hired. But the agencies themselves are also managed. And so, presidents, as we said, are put in charge of these agencies. But at times, even though they are responsible for seeing to it that they carry out their functions, sometimes there are problems with the agencies being responsive even to the requests of the president or the executive office of the president. At times, it is actually hard to get compliance. And there have been many examples of presidents having trouble with agencies that want to do things a certain way, which isn't the way they want it done. I mean, for example, former President Trump was very angry with the Justice Department. Well, technically, he's in charge of the Justice Department, but only indirectly, because there's an attorney general, and when an attorney general appointed an independent counsel to investigate certain things that the former president had done, he was angry about it. But even though he supposedly is in charge of the agency, there are times when he can't control it as directly as he would like to. And that is true of all these agencies and any president. They can't really control them as much as they might like to. Another means of executive control is reorganizing bureaucracy. It can be reorganized, and normally that will require congressional approval, legislation to do. And presidents can also issue executive orders, and which are basically like directions to agencies that have the force of law, but that can be rescinded by subsequent presidents. There's also congressional control. The Senate confirms the president's nominations for these top jobs. They can approve the person, but they can also say no. There's also oversight and investigation, which we talked about a bit when we discussed Congress. That can be partisan. It can also be legitimate in an age of legislation or trying to uncover problems. If something goes wrong in a Department of Veterans Affairs has been investigated, for example, for not doing a good job of taking care of our veterans in the hospitals, for example. Well, Congress is right in there trying to find out what's going on. Why are the veterans being made to wait too long for medical care, etc.? And then control of agency budgets. That ultimately rests with Congress because Congress is ultimately responsible for passing a budget. And I will not expect you to memorize all this by any means, but understand federal budgets are determined through a very complex process that involves a lot of congressional committees really getting out into the weeds of what goes into each agency's budget. The judicial control part, so we had executive control, congressional control, and judicial control, involves naturally the law. We have a thing called the Administrative Procedure Act, 1946 law, that lays out how these agencies are supposed to conduct themselves, how they're supposed to make rules, how they're supposed to enforce the rules, how they're supposed to investigate, how the administrative courts are supposed to function. All of that is prescribed in the Administrative Procedure Act. The courts can all, and that ultimately will be scrutinized, potentially in the courts. There's also, sometimes people go off to the courts, the federal courts, what we call the Article 3 courts, the ones with the full federal court power, the district courts. We'll talk more about that, about how the courts are structured. But these are the federal district courts, the trial courts of the federal system. People go in there and try to stop agencies from issuing orders even before the rules have been published. So they'll go in and say, Your Honor, please don't let this, this agency, the Federal Communications Commission or whatever agency it might be, don't let them issue this rule. It's unconstitutional, that sort of thing. So sometimes that happens. And the judicial control is also designed to make sure that the agencies respect people's due process of law rights. Businesses and individuals who feel they're being abused by government agencies can go right into court and litigate it, get lawyers, bring in witnesses, evidence, etc. And now within the agencies, there's another set of courts, and this is important to understand. The federal district courts, appellate courts, Supreme Court that we'll talk about next week, they are what we call Article 3 courts. They exercise the full federal judicial power of the Article 3 of the Constitution. But as I've said earlier, within these agencies, within the FCC, within OSHA, within the EPA, they have their own little what are called administrative courts to adjudicate claims that people have violated their rules. So, they might actually bring an action against, say, a business that is supposedly polluting it to excess, putting too much pollution into the air or water. That might end up, or start, I should say, in a court in the Environmental Protection Agency. Now, it might end up in a full federal district court as well, but understand there are these little tiny administrative law courts in these agencies, and there's a lot of them, and they do a lot of work, and most of it is invisible to the public, but they do a lot of work. So now let me give you a case study. You may need to go to the PowerPoint and have it open in front of you to understand this, because I'm not going to read all of this, but I want to give you a case study of how a federal regulation works. In this case, I'm using the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC. And the example I'm using is these annoying phone calls that we get from telemarketers. Nobody likes receiving these. And it is regulated. The reason it's regulated is because people don't like it. So, 1991, Congress passed a law. Remember how this starts? Congress passes a law. It's called the Telephone Consumer Protection Act, TCPA. That law made it illegal to send text messages to your landline or your cell phone using something called an automatic telephone dialing system, or ATDS, unless you consent to it. Now, there's an exception to this, which is when they're trying to collect debts. Then they can use an automatic dialing system to call people to collect debts. But, that's because they have a relationship with you. But these people who are just, calling you, robo-calling you all the time, they're not supposed to be able to do that. Now you're going to say, wait a minute, this happens all the time. Well, let me explain. Now, each violation of the TCPA can result in $500 in damages. And people who are doing it on purpose and knowing that it's illegal, they can have to pay $1,500 in damages. So what is an automatic telephone dialing system, ATDS? It is equipment which has the capacity, now focus on that word, I bolded that because there's a reason, remember that word, the capacity to store or produce telephone numbers to be called using a random or sequential number generator and to dial them. So it's an automatic dialing system that just can store lots and lots of phone numbers or get them from somewhere and just call them and call them and call them. All right? Now, they're not supposed to do that without your consent. So the act, then, that Congress passed authorizes the FCC to prescribe regulations to implement the act. So that's the process that I've been trying to describe to you. Congress passes a law and says to the FCC, we want you to do something, and we want you to create some regulations to do that thing that we've asked you to do. What is the thing? Do something about these automatic telephone dialing systems, calling people all the time. FCC, you figure it out. Because the FCC, they're the experts, right? Congress isn't the experts on this. It's too much work. They don't understand it. They hand it over to the experts and say, you implement our law. So since then, the FCC has issued a number of specific regulations. Well, one of it was originally it didn't include cell phones. In 1991, it didn't include cell phones, and they added them in 2003. They created exceptions, one exception being they're allowed to use these things, to automatic dialers, in serious health situations. We'll set that aside for now, but there are, just understand, the FCC created regulations that added to the act, that created exceptions. They did what Congress wanted them to do, pass some rules about this. 2013, the FCC issued a declaratory ruling and order, and they said, we are going to clarify what an automatic telephone dialing system is. Because, technology advances, and so rules have to be passed to try to cover the latest technology. And key question is, what does that term capacity mean? Remember we talked about it's technology that has the capacity to store and dial numbers. What does capacity mean? So the commission said, well, we are not going to focus on just the present capacity of devices. We're going to think in terms of the capacity of a device in terms of its potential. What if it was modified? In other words, we're going to say, we're not just going to say, well, a device today doesn't have the capacity to automatically dial all these numbers. But what if it can be modified? What if with different software it could? So they're saying we'll call it an ATDS if it has the capacity, if it could be modified to automatically dial numbers. They also said, what about consent? We have to clarify what we mean by consent. If you consent to be dialed, how do we know if you've consented? What if, they're saying, what if the industry says, we're dialing a number for someone who did consent, but that's not that person's number anymore. It's now been reassigned to someone else, you or me, let's say. Now, are they in the clear on this? Can they call that number because the previous owner of the number consented, or do they have to get the consent of the new owner of the number? They also said they're going to clarify how you express the fact that you don't consent. Who decides whether the caller has refused consent? If they're calling me, do I make that decision? Or does the robocaller make the decision and say, oh, no, he didn't, he consented. And I say, no, I didn't consent. Whose decision should the FCC take? And then the question was the healthcare exception. Remember, it said healthcare emergencies is an exception. They can call you because of healthcare emergencies. Well, they say, yeah, how about if we're trying to sell medical services and products? Then that should fit within the exception. Should it really? Is that a healthcare emergency that we want to sell you something? So this shows you then how I'm trying to show you here how this administrative rulemaking works and how it's reviewed by courts. Um, the uh, the standard, that is, when the courts review this rulemaking process that we just talked about, they answer this question: were the FCC's actions arbitrary, capricious, and abuse of discretion, or not in accordance with the law? So that's the nature of the judicial review of what the agency does when they make their rules. They also say, in trying to figure out, how the agency interprets their statute, their enabling statute, they say there's a standard called the Chevron standard. It's named after a Supreme Court case, Chevron versus National Resource Defense Council from 1984. And the question is pretty simple. The standard is, though this is what the Supreme Court would do, they would say, has Congress spoken to the precise question? And if they haven't, is the agency's answer based on a permissible construction of the statute? So this is what the courts are going to ask themselves. If the FCC does something with these automatic telephone dialers, they'll say, did Congress speak about the question that the FCC made a rule about? If they did, that's what we're going to look at. Let's read what Congress said. And if they didn't, then they ask is whether the FCC is permissibly construing the statute. In other words, is it reasonable? Is the interpretation that FCC gives the statute a reasonable interpretation of the statute? And this one is what I'm just reading to you is from a 2018 decision called ACA International versus FCC. Someone sued the FCC for the rules that they made. Now, and the case was taken before one of the federal appellate courts, and they said that applying the standards I just went over with you to the challenges of that were made against the FCC's rulings about the ATDS, the court said, this is what they said about what the FCC did. We set aside their decision about what qualifies as an ATDS. We also set aside their understanding of when a caller violates the act over this consent issue. But, they said, because they didn't like the way the FCC did that, but they sustained the Commission's ruling that you or I can revoke our consent through any reasonable means. And they also upheld their decision about the healthcare-related calls. So, partly the court upheld what the FCC did, and partly they struck it down. Now, the reason, I'll just tell you briefly, this whole question about why did they strike down the FCC's ruling about what devices they were considered auto dialers. And the reason was pretty simple. They felt that in talking, because the FCC said if a device can be modified through software changes to do automatic phone calls, then it's an ATDS and it's illegal and we can regulate it and you can't use it. Well, the problem was that as we looked at the devices that it might include, smartphones, the ones like we have in our pockets, have the capacity to be an automatic telephone dialing system. Even a smartphone can be used as an ATDS. I personally did not know this until I read about this case, but and so the court says, you know what, this regulation the FCC made is too broad because it could even include smartphones. And that would mean that if you send a mass message to a bunch of your friends, let's say you use your phone to mass mail all your friends to invite them to a party, then have you used an automatic telephone dialing system? Because the fine for that is $500 for every call. So they said that means really the way the FCC looked at the issue of capacity to regulate ATDSs was wrong. And so they this is the point of this, to understand this, what I'm trying to get you to understand is that agencies can't just make any rule they want. The rules are subject to judicial scrutiny. And if they exceed their authority, which they did a little bit in the FCC case, then the courts strike down the regulation. So they said it is not a reasonable decision, and they struck it down. They set aside the Commission's rulings on those matters. So understand, when people are always complaining about, out-of-control bureaucrats and that sort of thing, understand when they make a rule, it can be challenged. It can be challenged in court before judges, federal judges, who can strike down the regulation. So all these corporations that are constantly complaining about regulations, if they exceed Congress's authority, those regulations can be struck down, and it happens all the time. So just understand that. Now let's talk a bit about the politics of the federal budget. We'll have more to say about that when we talk later in the course about the social welfare policy and economic regulatory policy, or economic policy. But let's just get an overview of the system. First, some basic concepts about deficit and debt. Deficit and debt are two different things. Deficit refers to the budget of the federal government for 1 year. So if the government takes in less money than it spends in a given year, from October 1st to October 1st, in a given year, if they spend more than they took in that year, in that 1 year, that's called a budget deficit. But debt is the aggregate amount of money, the total amount of money that the federal government owes. And that amount of money is called debt. And it has been accumulated over many, many years. So every year the budget that the government runs a budget deficit, more money is added to the total debt. So there's deficit and then there's debt, right? So I'm going to show you some data on the budget surpluses and deficits over the years. But just understand that there's a number of ways to look at this. One way is to look at it in the total dollar amount, which is mind-boggling. You look at the total dollar amount that the federal government owes, you go, oh my God, that's an enormous amount of money. Well, it is. But you also have to understand that the economy grows as well. And the way economists usually look at deficits and debt is in terms of their relationship to the total size of the economy. So, if we compare, if we say our debt went up, but the size of the economy also went up, then that puts it in a different perspective. So let's begin. This slide again. This is more information from Fred, from the Federal Reserve, and it just shows you at zero. That is, shows you all those years from many years going back. That typically the federal government was balanced, the federal budget every year was balanced or very close to it. And you start to see it going out of whack after Reagan was elected in 1980. We see that after 12 years of a balance of deficits. Bill Clinton was elected, the Democratic president, in 1992. And by the time he left office, we were back in the realm of having surpluses again. George Bush, Republican, was elected, and we end up in a deficit state. And I'm going to now move this to a different slide so you can see this more closely. This is just the last few decades. The previous slide took us all the way back, to another century. This is just basically since 1970, 1980, 75, 80. And you can see that our budgets began to go out of whack under Reagan and Bush. And I have red means it's a Republican president, blue means it's a Democratic president. So you can see that, and I'm going to explain why this is happening in a minute. But you can see that we began to develop deficits during the first Reagan and Bush administration's 12 years. We began to go into the hole. Bill Clinton became president. That's the Democratic president. In his 8 years, we got the budget back into the realm of surplus. Then Bush 43 came in, invaded Iraq, and borrowed the money to do it and drove us into deficits. But we were coming out of those deficits after getting out of the war and so forth. And then you see those gray lines, those gray bands are recessions. Those vertical gray bands are recessions. We had a horrendous recession that started in 2007, some say, into 2008. And our budget went way out of whack. Now, why? You can see the blue line going down. That's a deficit, a massive deficit. And that's the way Barack Obama's administration started, with a huge catastrophe. We ran those deficits because the federal government did things to stimulate the economy, and they did it by borrowing a lot of money to get us out of the recession, which happened. We did come out of that recession, and as you can see, the budget line was becoming more and more and more normal as we approached the end of the Obama administration, and Trump came in and drove the budget deficits up again. You can see the line going down. During the 4 Trump years, the deficits increased. Now, why is that? And then you can see we see the massive spending that was occurred because of COVID. So we ran deficits for several years, but you can see at the very end that now we're starting to get back on track again. Now, why is it that the Republican presidents, who are always talking about balancing budgets, how come they're the ones who always drive the budget out of balance? And why is it up to the Democratic presidents who end up trying to move us toward a balanced budget again? Which is the opposite of what most people think is happening. And the reason is usually, well, almost always, because of 2 things: wars and tax cuts. Reagan cut taxes on the wealthy and other people as well, to some extent on the middle class. Bush, 43, tax cuts for the rich. Trump, tax cuts for the rich. These things all happened under Republican presidents. They don't typically happen. Democratic presidents don't cut taxes on rich people normally. And this led to a reduction in federal revenues. That is, if you cut taxes on the wealthiest people in the country, it can throw the federal government budget way out of whack, because a lot of money that they would have, they don't get. And the other thing is wars. In the case of Bush, the other factor in the creation of the deficit was war, and that happened at the tail end of the Bush 41 as well, when the first invasion of Iraq. These things hurt the federal budget because they're expensive. Wars are expensive, and they don't generate much money. It's not like after you win, you make a profit. I mean, these going and invading other countries and going to war and blowing things up and paying soldiers combat pay and all this, and then paying for their rehabilitation and their injuries and so forth, to get them, hopefully back to health again. All this is very, very expensive. And so, we need to do things differently. If we want a balanced budget, we need to probably tax the rich, and we probably need to avoid wars. Now, this is the total federal debt. Now, I'm going to show you 2 slides on this. The first, this is the total amount that has been. I've shown you the deficits. Now I'm showing you the debt. Remember, deficit is annual, debt is total. And you can see where that is accumulated over time. There was a time when it was small. Federal debt total was small. Now it's really big. It looks really terrifying, doesn't it? Now let's look at it by as a percentage of the gross domestic product. And again, you can see when you start comparing it to the growth in the economy at the same time, you can see it's a slightly different picture. I'm not saying it's good. I mean, we don't really want gigantic federal debt, and we don't want it to be a high percentage of our gross domestic product. But right now our total debt is more than the annual gross domestic product. We owe more total than an entire year's gross domestic product of the country, and that's not good. However, on the good side, if you look at the very end, you can see it's starting to go down. Federal debt as a percentage of the GDP is finally starting to go down. And so perhaps that will continue. That would probably be a good thing. A few key concepts about the federal budget that I'd like you to know. Terminology. One of the most important is discretionary spending versus mandatory spending. The federal budget has certain categories in it. And it can be divided up into mandatory spending, which is programs like Social Security and others that where the money is already committed, it must be spent. It's mandatory spending. Then there's something called discretionary spending. And discretionary spending is things that we can either spend or not spend. We can spend money on it or not. Lawmakers control it. They can decide whether to spend money on certain things. Interest is the amount we have to pay every year on the money we've already borrowed. In other words, the interest on the national debt, so to speak. The way governments borrow money is by selling bonds. If you buy a bond, then basically it's like an IOU. The government owes you money, and they pay you interest on that. So these are the basic categories. And And then when we talk about revenue, often people use the term revenue. They'll say, what about revenue? Well, what they mean is the money that's coming in to the government, mostly in the form of tax payments. Now, if we took the 2019 fiscal year budget, you would find that the total amount that the government was going to spend in that year was $4.4 trillion. And the total amount they were taking in was $3.5 trillion, with a deficit of $0.9 trillion. Well, if you give wealthy people a tax break, you end up often running deficits like this, because you have, in this case, like maybe as much as $1 trillion in money that you don't get in revenue from the taxpayers. So again, using the 2019 budget as an example, 61% of that budget was mandatory spending. Only 30% of it was discretionary, and 9% was interest on the national debt. So when people talk about balancing the budget, you see the problem we're talking about here? The problem is that only 30% of it is discretionary. I mean, 70% of it you have to pay. You have to pay the Social Security. You have to pay the mandatory payments that you've committed to making. Federal contracts that you already have committed to that you have to pay. Military pensions and other things. You have to pay interest on the national debt. You can't default on that. That only leaves 30% of the budget for members of Congress to play around with in an effort to make a, quote, balanced budget. So it's not as much as you might think. And if you look at the total outlays and all the different categories that money went for in that year, 24% of it was Social Security. What are you going to do? Not pay people? 14% Medicare, 12% Medicaid, 12% other mandatory spending programs, interest on the debt, 9%. Non-defense discretionary funds, 15%. Defense discretionary, 15%. So you see, what do? You've got 30% discretionary funds. Half of it is defense, and half of it is non-defense. You're going to cut the military? Really? When you suggest cutting the military budget in this country, people go insane. It becomes particularly Republicans, but Democrats as well. Oh no, we can't cut the military budget. Well, but if you don't, then where do you cut the budget? Are you going to cut everything in? Try to balance the budget by only cutting non-defense discretionary funding? What, the Department of Education? What are you going to cut? You see, it doesn't leave. So you see, cutting budget deficits is not as easy as it sounds, because you end up having to look at this 30% of the budget that is discretionary, and half of that is the military, which nobody wants to cut because they want them to defend our country. And so if you start cutting, try to balance the budget through cuts to non-defense discretionary, you're talking about many programs that people really care about. So that's why it's not as easy as it sounds. This just shows you a picture of where these expenditures have come from over time, where these budget categories have changed over time. So like the dark blue, that's defense. That's what we spend on defense, and as you can see, it's much higher than it was back in the 1960s. The blue is the non-defense discretionary, lighter blue. The red is Medicare. The kind of orange is Medicaid. Yellow is Social Security. Look how much that's gone up, and so forth. Now, one of the reasons why we are spending more on Social Security is because of the aging of the generation called the baby boom generation. These are people who were born, let's say, from 1946 through 1961 or 65, depending upon who you listen to. About a 20-year period, say 46 to 65, 19 years. Those people who were born in that generation are a huge chunk of the population. It was a massive generation. There was a high birth rate in the country during those years. And that generation is now aging into the Social Security years. And so the commitment that our government has made to pay pensions, Social Security, and Medicare payments for the medical needs of those people has now become a much bigger chunk of the budget, because there's a lot of people in that group. And also because medical expenses are much higher than they used to be. There are new medical procedures, new drugs, etc. We will talk more about this when we get to social welfare spending later on, social welfare policy later on in the course. But I'm just trying to impress upon you that this big so-called out-of-control bureaucracy, first, in terms of people, it isn't increasing in size, number one. The federal budget does go up, absolutely. But the needs of the country, the size of the economy also went up. And I'm trying to help you understand that the crazy runaway rules that they make are not so crazy or runaway. They're carefully scrutinized by the courts, and there's a very elaborate process for making those rules in the first place. There's a lot of public comment and input. So, is the federal bureaucracy a terrible, awful thing? Well, I mean, they've brought water to the west and running water and electricity to the south. They've built the interstate highway system. They've helped us fight wars and defend the country, and done many, many other things that we've been talking about. It is a rational way of trying to carry out complex tasks. That is what bureaucracy is, involving hierarchy and division of labor and professionalization and so forth. And so, when people run it down and try to make bureaucracy a pejorative term, in other words, a bad word, I hope that you have a sense now of what it actually does, and you can evaluate those statements a little more accurately, because the picture is a lot more complex than that, isn't it? And so that concludes our section on bureaucracy.